Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's Tech Talk 2020. I'm Bill Oakes, and with me today in silent mode is Aaron White. He unfortunately has laryngitis, but he is here in spirit as well as listening in. Today's guest is going to be Andrew Messer, CEO of Arvata, and he'll be talking about implementing an enterprise GraphQL server. Now, if you didn't hear anything I just said, you can clearly see the screen, hopefully. We are talking. You do need to connect to your telephone audio by locating audio and select telephone. Dial using the information provided, not the information seen on my screen, the information you see on your screen. Once connected, you can enter your audio PIN to identify your line, and at that point, you'll be successfully connected to audio. If you drop for any reason, simply reconnect. You can expand and collapse your panel if you want to get it off your screen just by clicking on that little orange icon with the arrow on it. As you can see, that blows it up and shrinks it down. You can select and view your audio. If you don't want to use your phone, you can switch over to your microphone and speakers. And finally, most importantly, if you have any questions or comments during this session, please absolutely enter them in. We will have a dedicated Q&A at the end. And everybody is muted for recording purposes. You will find this Tech Talk available on API Academy in about 5 to 6 hours from close of this session. With that, I want to briefly discuss API Academy itself. As you saw from last month, we do have a new look and feel on the website, and we just added another really cool feature. You can now register for updates so that anytime one of our subject matter experts puts up a how-to video or just a thought leadership type of blog, you'll be alerted to that. You can register for that in various locations across the site via these little pop-ups. I definitely recommend it. And next month's Tech Talk is it's a 2-for-1. Next month, we are going to roll out yet another component to API Academy. We're actually going to shake up the industry a little bit with this one. And then we'll have our own Eric Day talking about OAuth and OpenID Connect. You can see that on April 29th, 1 month from now. Today's guest, as I mentioned, is Andrew Messer, CEO of Arvata, and he's going to be talking about implementing an enterprise GraphQL server. And with that, I'm going to switch everything over to Andrew.
Thank you, Bill.
You are good to go.
All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm very excited to talk about our company as well as our technology. I thought I'd start out just a little bit about a brief history of our company and ultimately the problems that we set out to solve. We're about 2.5 years into building enterprise GraphQL solutions. We started out spending about a year kind of thinking about the realm of possibility, a couple of different prototypes, followed by actually a short period of time bringing the ideas to fruition and working with existing Layer7 API Gateway customers to prove the value and technology of what you're able to see today. So ultimately, we focused on proving things at telco scale. So very confident in the value proposition, the scalability and performance of what you're about to see today. So most of us at Arvata are GraphQL Layer7 API management experts, security and integration as well. So ultimately, we have deep backgrounds on the technology platform, and leveraging those experiences, we thought about kind of the future in terms of where things were headed, and ultimately started to focus on a real problem that faces the enterprise today in terms of data access. So there have been enormous advancements in technologies over the past few decades. Dedicated hosts led way to virtualization, enter SaaS, containerization, cloud, you name it. The trend has continued to be a proliferation of technology. And as the enterprise has embraced, adopted those technologies, the net result has been data now lives everywhere. So sitting back, thinking about the problem and how do you solve that in an elegant way to make it simple for the enterprise to provide data securely with governance, ultimately is where our minds took us. In doing so, we built a bridge that makes it simple for the enterprise to provide data to those that need to consume it in a way that it's easy to understand with security and governance. In doing so, we leveraged a technology that came from Facebook. So in the 2012 timeframe, Facebook sat down to reimagine and re-architect their mobile experience. A few bright engineers sat down, thought about the size and scale of Facebook, the data, and all the elements that they would need to bring about a modern experience for now into the future. And ultimately, a specification came out of that called GraphQL. GraphQL is simply a query language for API. And ultimately, we're going to go through a demonstration today that will show you the experience or the power of GraphQL firsthand. But ultimately released in the 2015 timeframe to the public, open source in a friendly way in the 2017 timeframe, and moved to 2018 to a GraphQL Foundation. The ownership moved to the GraphQL Foundation. In terms of just providing a high-level compare and contrast of GraphQL versus traditional legacy technology, I think it's easiest to compare it to REST. I first want to say that this is by no means a stance by Arvata that all things REST will become GraphQL. We simply view GraphQL as a powerful tool in the API war chest. Use cases make sense for it, use cases don't make sense for it. So ultimately, we do see it as an evolution of web services and API, and there are a lot of benefits, but again, we are not saying that this is a full stop replacement for REST. So if you think about our REST world in terms of developing clients, you need to know the individual resources, the targets of data, and the resources that those targets provide. So in a simple application, you could be connecting to hundreds, if not thousands of endpoints, receiving multiple requests, having to worry about API chaining, API orchestration, receiving data that you don't need, parsing through it, and ultimately rendering a response that's needed for your client or client application. If you contrast that with GraphQL, you can think of GraphQL as a single entry point into your data. GraphQL is agnostic, so it doesn't really care about the data sources, but the main thing that this does from a client API development perspective is it transitions the mindset of the developer from worried about all of the necessary information about backend resources and what they provide to simply working from a data mindset. GraphQL is very performant. The client is in control in the size and shape of the request. So ultimately, make one request for the data that you need, receive exactly that data back. So gone are the days of overfetching, and ultimately removing multiple round trips to backend services from clients such as mobile can offer huge performance gains. So when we combine that technology with the Layer7 API Gateway, there are two solutions that we provide. First, we provide the ability to use the Layer7 API Gateway as a GraphQL server. And second, we provide the ability to use the gateway in a traditional sense and as a security proxy for GraphQL servers that may have already been implemented into your environment. So best of both worlds. You can use the gateway as a server, or you can protect existing servers in your environment. In terms of developing the server-side aspect of Arvata's technology for GraphQL, we leveraged our experience working with customers across the globe with their Layer7 implementations, understanding all of the things that you need to do to lifecycle manage Layer7 API management in the enterprise. So ultimately, we spent a lot of time, energy, and effort abstracting all of the components that you would need to implement GraphQL successfully in your environment, made it easy to connect to backend data sources, made it easy to secure front-end access to the API, made it easy to move all of those elements from low-level environments to high-level environments, because underpinning the solution, everything is configuration-driven. We set out with the mindset to ensure that the end result would be tooling that is compatible with DevOps processes and allow you to drive deployments through your CICD tooling of choice. So while we're going to show you our user interface and management console today for the server side of the equation, ultimately, just want to make it known that the underpinning technology has a very robust CLI that allows you to accomplish the same thing for DevOps integration. So when you add all of this up, at the end of the day, it's an enterprise GraphQL server gateway. I know it's kind of an identity crisis and sometimes hard to think of the gateway, which is largely a message pump, as an actual server. So ultimately, that is the case. You now have the ability to use the Layer7 API Gateway as a server. And in doing so, you're moving it beyond fine-grained access. You're moving it beyond authorization, authentication to the APIs themselves, and increasing the capabilities to actually make individual security decisions on the individual data elements of an API. And when you think about that in today's time and context, there's a lot of effort afoot for not only digital transformation, but in doing so, there's a lot of challenges that present themselves in terms of consent, global data privacy, and fill in the blank Privacy Act. We spent a lot of time making sure that the UI was point and click driven, so that the resulting artifacts are all of the policy automatically created for you and deployed to the gateway. Leveraging the security strengths of the Layer7 API Gateway is at the core of our solution. As I mentioned, we wanted to make it simple to connect to and retrieve information from backend data sources, and have created this concept of not only templates for connections to those backend systems, but templates for actually retrieving the information from those backend systems and returning the final results that a GraphQL client requested. We also use the templatized approach as an opportunity to create a really robust set of metrics. So in the policy that gets deployed to the gateway, there are an astounding amount of metrics that we provide in terms of the overall experience from client to backend system. And Doyle is actually going to go through a little bit of that today to show you some examples of the capabilities there. And then again, leveraging the Layer7 API Gateway platform, its maturity and time in market, it's a time-proven scalable platform. So in terms of what we're going to do for the rest of this presentation, Casey Gibson, who's our product manager, is going to walk you through setting up the Layer7 Gateway as a GraphQL server using our UI. Transition to handing the baton over to Doyle Reese, who will cover the analytics capabilities of our solution. In addition, we're going to show you how with GraphQL, and I think this is a really powerful use case to think about when considering the technology in your enterprise. It's very challenging for the enterprise to migrate to couple the monolith and migrate to microservices. So we'd like to just quickly show you how you can leverage this technology to, within a few clicks, without interruptions to your clients, without actually causing clients to be rewritten, switch from, say, a SOAP service to Lambda function sitting in AWS. And last but not least, we're going to show you, using the Layer7 developer portal, how to deploy the GraphQL proxy to protect existing GraphQL servers in your environment. So this is my last slide, and then we're going to pass it off to Casey for the demo, but we just wanted to put some context in terms of what we're going to demonstrate. We're going to create a GraphQL endpoint on a Layer7 gateway called Arvata. Arvata is a single entry point to data across SOAP, REST, MongoDB, and Oracle backend systems. We'll show you how easy it is to actually deploy the GraphQL API, and then the developer experience that comes along with our application to show you the true power of GraphQL. Simply, the clients become data focused and move from needing to know the intricacies of backend systems. Simply, GraphQL allows you to abstract that away from the client and isolate it to the backend. So with that, Bill, ready to transition to Casey.
Okay, Casey, you should be good to go. And we see your screen.
All right. Yep. Very good. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Casey Gibson, Product Manager at Arvata. I'm going to take you through a brief demonstration of the product. But before I dig into that, I'm going to want to use a new Layer7 API Gateway for this demonstration. So I'll just quickly show you a tool that we've built. We call it Arvata Bot. It's just a Slack app that allows us to quickly create and tear down API Gateway containers. So I'll go ahead and fire that up. That's going to take a couple minutes to get up and running. While we're waiting for that, I'll go ahead and get signed into our UI. So as you can see here, our UI is laid out sort of in inbox format with the core components listed over here to the left, the instances of those core components immediately to the right. The first tab we're taken to here is the API gateways. And you can see we already have a couple gateways that are in this organization that we're using. We took a very gateway-centric approach to this product. So all of your gateways are listed here. You can do all of the management of those gateways directly through this list, and all of the components that actually exist on those gateways can all be managed directly through here. You can see this gateway that we have out there has an endpoint on it. It has a schema. It has several connectors. I'll get into what those are a little bit more here in a minute. But let's, for now, go ahead, and this gateway should be ready for me. I just need the host and port of this. And come back over here into my UI. I can click Add a new API Gateway. I'll give it a name. And go ahead and paste that in. Click Connect. Then this is going to go out and do that initial SSL handshake with the gateway. I can get some basic information back just to see, okay, yep, that is the gateway that I'm trying to onboard here. Select the installation package. This is just the version of the content that will actually be deployed to my gateway. And then I want to give it a administrator username and password, and I'll click Authorize Connection. Now what this is going to do is it's actually going to go out to the gateway, and it's going to lay down a few solution kits onto that gateway. Those solution kits are things like, it contains things like policy fragments and a few assertions that we have created specifically for our GraphQL solution. All right, so now we have this gateway in our solution ready to go. And first thing we would want to do here then is go ahead and add a GraphQL endpoint to it. Now, what actually happens when we deploy this endpoint to the gateway is it will publish policy. It uses a template of policy that we've created that is configuration driven. So all of these settings that you see in here are things that will actually drive the execution of the policy that's published to the gateway. So ideally, there's no policy manager involved here. You don't even have to open policy manager. Everything is just all done through here. We've taken a lot of the policy authoring out of it for you. That's one of our goals here. So let me just give this a name. Now, one of the first components I need to choose here is a schema. I'll go ahead and choose a schema that we already have uploaded to this organization. In GraphQL, a schema is like your contract between your client and your server. And in our product, we've actually taken that a bit further. So it's that contract, but it also contains the resolvers, which in GraphQL, it is like the instructions telling your GraphQL server how to go and fetch the data from the backend. So that's all contained within this schema that we're uploading here. And that is something that would probably live like in your source control. But then we also give you the ability to upload different versions. So if I wanted to roll back to a previous revision of this schema, I can do that directly through here. The next thing I want to choose is my environment. The environment, think of it as dev, QA, prod type of a thing. It's a collection of your backend resources that you'll be using for this specific implementation. So if I have that schema that's laid out all of my, excuse me, my resolvers, I don't necessarily, I want to be able to use that schema in my different environments without having to completely rewrite it for the different backends it would use. So it was a way for us to kind of decouple our actual logic with where the data itself exists. And again, this also helps it to be configuration driven. So if you're doing this as part of CICD, you can just point to your environment, point to your schema, and stand up new endpoints on the fly. Down here, we have a few other things. We've got some pretty basic HTTP properties here that we can set. We also have GraphQL properties we can set. I'm going to go ahead and turn on introspection. Introspection is what allows the client to actually interact with that data just by knowing the URL effectively. That's something that obviously would be great for like a dev environment, but you might not want to have that in production. So we give you the ability to turn that on and off. A couple other things we have here: max query depth, max query complexity enabled. Because GraphQL gives you the ability to define the shape of your query as a client, there are some things that we like to have in place just to prevent the client from doing some crazy query that might blow up your back end. So just a couple control measures that we have in place. Some GraphQL extensions here. These are things that help with debugging and some specific performance metrics that we can provide. We have the ability to set a quota on this specific endpoint. And down here, then we have security options. We can choose from OAuth 2. We can choose from a few different JSON Web Token options. We also have the ability to do API keys, and then we have a custom option here, which would actually allow you to bring your own policy fragment if you wanted to. If for some reason the other security types that we have here don't fit what you need, you can write your own policy for security to this specific endpoint. One thing I skipped over above here that I'm going to go back and cover now actually is this portal managed toggle. So if the gateway that you're deploying to actually happens to be a gateway that is using the Layer 7 developer portal, you can turn this on, and that would make it so this endpoint actually shows up in that portal. And it also changes your security options down here. So it changes to the out-of-the-box security options that are available for the portal. So you can choose the portal managed OAuth or portal managed API keys if you choose to do that. And the last thing down here that we could choose to set up before we deploy our endpoint is our logging type. So as Andrew mentioned earlier, we provide some very rich analytics out of the box. Just by deploying this, we've captured several data points that we think are really nice to show for the execution of this actual API. You just have to pick what you want to do with it. So you do nothing, or you can send it internally to the gateway. We also have built-in integrations for Elasticsearch and Splunk that will allow you to send the data out there. And then again, another custom option here. If you don't like what we have out of the box, you can bring your own policy fragment and send it wherever you want. We have it configured in such a way where, excuse me, the sending of the data will not actually impact your client. It's all done in the that's all done in the background. So I'll go ahead and click Create Endpoint, and that's going to go out and actually send this endpoint to the gateway. So we now have this endpoint actually up and running. Now, once we have an endpoint, next thing we might want to do is put together some kind of documentation that we can share with our developers. Luckily, GraphQL makes that really easy for us. And we have over here this section for portals. I could add a new portal specifically for that endpoint, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you one that we already have up and running. So this is a developer portal. This is kind of like our administration panel for this. We can come in here and edit the content that's actually going to go into this. We can do some customizations for color, logos, things like that, and then actually set up the access control as well. Let me go ahead and show you then what this looks like once it's published. So this is the actual developer experience that you would for your front end developer. A few things over here that we get out of the box. This visualize piece, there's a tool called GraphQL Voyager that uses that introspection to actually provide this diagram of your schema, so you can see visually what your schema looks like. This can be really nice, especially when some of those schemas start to get really large. It can be really helpful just to kind of see how to traverse the data. Next, we have some content. This is just some custom content that we added. We allow you to use Markdown to do things like, add links and embed videos, embed images, things like that. Then down here, we have our built-in documentation for GraphQL. So because GraphQL can use that schema, it can get all the data specifically from the schema. So this is all given to you just automatically. Just by having that strongly typed data definition, you get this right away, right out of the box. Then finally, we have the option to use this tool called GraphQL. GraphQL is a test client for GraphQL. Think of it kind of like Postman or SOAP UI, but specifically made for GraphQL. And again, because it has that introspection feature, we can drill in over here. We've got this documentation panel, and we can actually see what queries and mutations are available to us. GraphQL uses the concept of queries. That's sort of like a get, just to get your data. Mutation is anything that would change the data. So post, put, delete, that's all handled under mutations. But I can see query, I see what queries are available to me, and I could even go as far as to see, okay, I've got accounts by last name, that returns an account. Well, what is an account? Account has ID, last name, first name, all of these different things. So I can see right away what data is available to me, and I can go ahead and come over here and actually run this query, and you can see that this is what the query would look like, and then this is the response. So you can see one of the things that's really nice is that the query lines up almost exactly with the response. You're asking for and receiving exactly what you need. If I wanted to add some additional info in here, maybe I want the street address, I can query for that as well, and I also get the street address. Maybe I don't want this much data, I can take that out and get exactly what I asked for. Now, one thing to note is, as the front-end developer, this is all I need to care about, right? I know this is the information I need. This is what I asked for. But I can tell you, as I helped to design this demo environment, so I happen to know that, for example, these few fields here are getting data from a REST API, or I'm sorry, a SOAP API. This is coming from a REST API, and this data down here is coming from MongoDB. So this one query from your client is actually going out to 3 separate data sources, compiling that data and returning exactly what they need. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Doyle, actually, who's going to talk a little bit more about our analytics and the GraphQL proxy solution that we've put together. So, Bill, I don't know if, actually, it looks like I can hand it over to Doyle. There we go.
Got it.
Got it.
Okay, hello. All right, so making sure I am sharing. Awesome. I am. All right, so thank you, Casey. I appreciate that. So I'm Doyle Reese. I am an architect with Arvata, and I'm going to walk through and expand on a few topics that Casey touched on in regards to our analytics capabilities. So I'm going to go to our console and pick on this particular endpoint that we have out there currently. And I just want to reiterate a few points that Casey made about our logging capabilities. So as a consultant and architect that's traveled around and worked with a lot of Layer 7 implementations, one of the challenges that was a common theme is getting metrics or analytics out of their endpoints, out of their APIs, and into existing systems where they can perform analysis and understand if they're having trouble. So we wanted to make that extremely easy, and our solution here, I believe we solved just that. So literally, like, we are collecting a robust amount of analytics underneath the covers, and you can choose whether or not you want to actually take advantage of those analytics. And in this example, via selecting the Elasticsearch connector type, I can then offload these analytics to an Elasticsearch instance that we currently have up and running. And I've taken a Kibana dashboard and laid it over top that Elasticsearch instance and created a dashboard that represents just a subset of the potential visualizations that you may want to collect. So in this example, we're able to easily identify how many transactions have come through in a period of the last 15 minutes, the success failure ratios, successes and failures over time. There's some GraphQL specific metrics that we can show pretty easily, such as query depth and complexity analysis. You have concurrency by host that you can easily monitor to see what sort of, how many different clients and what sort of load they're sending in. But also I want to call attention to, in the GraphQL specific world, your backend connections, since there may be multiple different backends that could potentially cause problems. I want to draw attention to our different connectors that we monitor as well. So this gives you a really good idea to see how your backends are performing behind that GraphQL server. So here you can see I've got Mongo, SOAP, and REST being currently consumed, and you get an idea of the performance that those guys are incurring on the back end. And you just get an idea of overall, which of those different types of connectors are performing. And we can easily give you a viewpoint in the inbound request to the GraphQL server as represented over here on the left. I can drill down into this to show you all the possible metrics that you could visualize that maybe you're not seeing here. But the content type that was requested coming in, the specific endpoint that was hit on that gateway, which gateway it was, if you have a max complexity or query depth set, what is that? If you have a max concurrency set, what would that be? So just a lot of information there on the request side. Now on the connector side, so one individual request may be using one or more connectors on the back end. So we're also capturing that as well. And so it's we can easily count, the different, REST invocations that we do on the back end, whether or not they were successful. We can get an idea of the latency a specific connector may have incurred, and as it results to the overall latency of the request coming in. And again, I'll pick on one of these events and give you an idea of the potential metrics on this connector event that we have that could be visualized in a way that of your choosing. So also notice, to jump back up here, right now we're currently using Mongo, SOAP, and REST. We've got some automated traffic coming through this platform populating this data. So I'd like to also take advantage of this time to show you how we can easily modify one of our existing GraphQL endpoints that we have out there, and to update it to leverage a quote-unquote microservices backend. So currently, as represented by the red arrow, we have our accounts information is being sourced from a SOAP-based API. And what we want to do is break that SOAP-based API into multiple microservices, and then we'll update our GraphQL schema to leverage those microservices as opposed to that SOAP-based API. So I want to take a moment to do that now. So I'm going to come out to my Euclid environment. This is our UI. And right now, we're using this Arvata schema. So I'm simply going to choose our Arvata AWS schema that we have and pick my latest version that I have out there. And then I'm going to come down here and select Save. So this is performing a 0 downtime update to that GraphQL endpoint that we currently have running. And then I'm going to come back to our dashboard. And it takes about a few seconds for the dashboard to update, but we should start seeing Lambda traffic showing up here in the system, and we'll see a decrease or a total stoppage of the SOAP traffic coming through here in a few seconds. So just based on my experience, Lambda, once you first hit it, it takes a little bit to get warmed up. So you'll notice that this first little bit of traffic coming in, it's a little more latent as compared to the rest of the backend data sources. But you can also tell it's starting to warm up and come down. And eventually we'll see that arrive at around like 90 milliseconds here pretty soon. But and if we were able to zoom in, let me see if I can do that here on the screen, you should see a decrease, or SOAP should, it's going to be kind of hard to represent it, but SOAP is no longer being consumed. So everything is going up to that Lambda as opposed to SOAP. And we can come and take a look at the top, and the last dot's always a little wonky just because it doesn't have all the data to represent the dot, but we should be able to get a quick understanding of our success and failure ratio. Maybe I introduced a mistake. We would see all of a sudden our failures jump up, and we can see all that pretty easily from a dashboard similar to this. But so this is an example of how we can easily get the power of all of these metrics by simply pointing it to one of our out-of-the-box supported connectors, either Elasticsearch, or if you're a Splunk shop, we can do Splunk, or like Casey mentioned, we also have the ability for you to have and reference your own policy that you've written to parse and send that data in whatever method you wish to whatever log-based analytics solution or whatever solution you want. Now, just to be clear, everything we've talked about so far is leveraging the Arvata GraphQL server that's running on the gateway. And so the next part of my demonstration is I want to show you how we can actually use the Layer7 API developer portal to deploy an Arvata security GraphQL proxy to the Layer7 API Gateway. So maybe you already have your own implementation of GraphQL running in shop today, and you just want to take advantage of some of the security features that we offer and that the Layer7 API developer portal offer. So the next part of my demonstration is going to walk through setting up that proxy. All right, so I'm going to log in. Let me see, sometimes it's a little picky on timing. Yep, so let me log in real quick. So once I get in, I'm going to go to the publish tab, and then I'm going to add an API. So down under API details, I'm going to provide my proxy a name and a version. I also need to provide whatever existing GraphQL server that you're wanting to protect. That endpoint information can go here. Let's go ahead and assign a EULA. And if you have any descriptions that you want to specify, you can put that there. I'm going to give my proxy a URI path to listen on so that we know where to hit and where to forward traffic to. And then at Arvata, we have a policy template that is the Arvata GraphQL security policy template. So if you select and add that, you're prompted for some inputs that are needed for our proxy. So let me go out and copy my schema. I'm just going to paste that into here. And I'm going to enforce SSL. Yes, I do want to allow introspection. So the proxy will determine whether or not we pass through that introspection query to the backend. I can enforce a query depth. I'll demo this here in a second, but how nested we will allow the client queries to come in. And then how complex we want to allow those queries. And so I'm going to select a complexity level of 60 which is pretty close to the minimum needed for us to allow introspection to happen. And then we have the ability to enforce a few different auth schemes here. And then for demo purposes, I'm going to enforce the API key auth scheme. So these are the ones we currently have, but we can easily extend the template to meet whatever requirements that you may have. So then I'm going to hit next and then create. Now I should be prompted for a few permission items. So I'm just going to go ahead and select those and then hit save. Now my security proxy should be published to the gateway here in just a few minutes. While we're doing that, since we did select an API key enforcement auth scheme, I need to go ahead and map one of my applications or my clients to that API so that I can retrieve an API key to use against it. So I'm going to come out to this diamond application that I created, and I'm going to go to the management section and map that client to my proxy that I deployed. This will allow the gateway to enforce that this client can access this particular endpoint, and also any corresponding account and API plans that may be in place for that client. We will enforce those plans also, and I'll give you a little bit of a demo here in a second on that. All right, so now I have mapped that, and usually that takes a few minutes as well to sync up. So I should be able to navigate to GraphQL here. And so as Casey mentioned, this is the client that will allow us to call that backend endpoint. So notice it did perform an introspection query, and it notices that I can't pull back my introspection data because I don't have a token. So let's go back into our client and grab that API key. So let me copy that guy, and then I can modify my HTTP headers and specify that token on my next call. Notice I was able to do an introspection query, and then I'm gonna remove this part of that for now, and I'm gonna perform the call. And so I was able to, from the client, go through the GraphQL proxy, go to the backend server, and then return my response back to the client. So that is good. That's what we intended. So now, like, let's make sure the proxy is doing some of the items that we configured it to do. So I'm gonna nest my query just beyond the two levels that we're enforcing, and notice that we are indeed receiving a error because we're nested too deep. So that shows that the proxy is doing its thing. And to be sure of that, I can hit the back end directly and then pass in that same query, and we notice that it's returning as expected. So that shows us that he is performing what he says he or should be performing. So now this particular client has an account plan associated with it, as defined in the developer portal, that is throttling beyond, if you're averaging more than, I think, 1 or 2 transactions per second, you'll see that all of a sudden I can invoke that throttle that's happening. So that shows us that we can take advantage of the developer portal's account and API plans in front of your GraphQL server. So that's an awesome synergy that we have there with the developer portal. And we can leverage the Layer7 developer portal's monitoring capabilities to show that your GraphQL proxy traffic that you have coming in. And we can filter on specific endpoints here, and we can even go beyond that, and maybe we want to see as hit by our application that we have. So it's so it's full featured, like one of the out of the box templates, and yeah, and that's it, Bill. So back to you for questions.
Great, thank you very much. So with that, we are going to open up for Q&A. We do have a few questions that have already come in. I'll get started with those, but please do feel free to enter further questions into the questions panel. The first one, is there a one-to-one relationship between the gateway and schema? In other words, is there one schema per gateway?
I can take that one. No, you can deploy as many schemas to a gateway as you would like. There is a one-to-one relationship for the schema to an endpoint, but on that gateway, you could have several endpoints if you wanted to, and each one of those endpoints could use a different schema.
Okay. Is the GraphQL proxy based on Apollo? I saw Apollo tracing earlier in the presentation.
It is not. The GraphQL proxy, you could absolutely use Apollo as your backend if you wanted to. So really the GraphQL proxy, its whole purpose is to protect an existing GraphQL implementation that you might have. So by all means, if you were using Apollo, then that would work there. The Apollo tracing piece that was in there is really just specifically for some metrics that Apollo has provided. They did something where you basically can trace down to the nanosecond how long it takes for each of the fields of your response to actually be populated in GraphQL. And so that Apollo tracing it's just one of their, it's just something that Apollo created that we're leveraging within our product.
Gotcha. What do the resolvers look like? Are they gateway policy?
The resolvers are not gateway policy. They are actually, they're done using free marker templates. You can go out and do a Google search for free marker templates if you'd like. Basically what it is we're leveraging templates to allow you to define the actual communication with your backend. So things like your URI that you might use and any kind of formatting of the data that comes back, it's all templatized. And our CLI actually helps. It's something we didn't really get into here, but we have a very robust CLI that will allow you to do everything that you saw in the UI, but it also helps you to set up those templates that are used for your resolvers.
Gotcha. Here's another question that came in. My understanding was that GraphQL was versionless. What's the schema version for?
So versionless, Andrew, were you going to take that? I thought maybe I heard you for a second.
Sure, no problem. So correct. So in our application, we think it's important to have your schemas version for rollback capabilities and just be able to track changes between evolution. But from a client side perspective, the clients aren't tied to versions of your API. And so if you would like to add more information to the GraphQL API and say you add a new RESTful backend that provides new information, it doesn't change or break the client because the client's simply not consuming that information. So you don't have to cut a new version of clients every time you cut a new version of the API. If you'd like your client to consume new information provided by the GraphQL API, simply it needs, again, control of the size and shape of its requests. So it would need to make an update to actually request that additional information.
Okay, another question just came in, and I think I heard the answer to this, but I'm going to throw it out there. Do you have a way to integrate with CICD processes?
We do. So everything that you saw in the UI results in a configuration. So ultimately, our CLI that Casey just referenced is the way that you would create configurations to integrate with your CI/CD tooling of choice and perform deployments. So while you saw the visual way of creating deployments today, our CLI has the full capabilities to do the exact same thing, and then you would leverage that with your CI/CD tooling to perform those automated deployments from low-level environments to high-level environments. We put a lot of thought about the complexities of nobody replicates their dev environment. So how do you build one to use many, and ultimately our CLI is the driving force, and also just being everything's driven by configuration.
Sound good. Another question just came in, and this is really a time frame based question. You didn't show how to actually set up a schema, which from a time perspective, that would be difficult to accomplish. So how do you set up your upstreams behind your GraphQL proxy using connectors?
So just a quick summary on that. So as Casey kind of mentioned a little bit or alluded to, leveraging the CLI to basically initialize an Arvata project. And in there, depending on the complexity of the backends and how many different backends you want to do, you should be up and running in the matter of minutes if it's like an existing REST API that we sit on top of, or some database that we sit on top of. But it's most of your time is actually being spent in designing your data model and how you want that contract to be exposed to your client in itself. And then the resolvers are actually fairly easy and quick to configure once that part of the that decision has been made.
Excellent. And then do you have any performance benchmarks of your server?
We do. So that's something I'm actually working on putting together a report right now. We did some pretty thorough performance testing, and I unfortunately don't have that report to share right now, but I can tell you that the GraphQL server itself sitting on the gateway performed very similarly to the actual gateway itself. So we did a lot of tests doing, for example, where we would do the backend would be a REST API. And so we tested a backend REST API through GraphQL versus just hitting that REST API directly through the gateway. And honestly, the results were almost identical. There is slight overhead for GraphQL, but it really is negligible. And it all depends on, again, obviously your configuration of your gateway. The amount of traffic that can go through actually scales with the number of CPUs on that gateway. But I can tell you again, it performs almost identical to the actual performance of the gateway hitting those backends directly. And the one main benefit that we see with GraphQL, obviously, though, is that you can send in that single request from the client and have the GraphQL server actually hit multiple backends. So instead of having the client send in multiple requests, they send in that one, and it could go out to several different backends. And we noticed, actually, I was quite surprised that, to be honest, we were actually more performant than I would imagine we would have been. As far as exact metrics, I am hoping to get something published here soon that I can share with you guys. I'll have it out on our website, hopefully within the next couple weeks, to get some real performance data for you.
Okay, another question just came in. Is it possible to limit access to parts of the schema for different user groups, and if so, how?
Yeah, I can talk to that. So inside of the schema, or on the endpoint, there is an authentication and authorization section. So we define how do we want to allow traffic to come to the endpoint. And as part of that, whether it's JOT-based or OAuth or some custom IDP that we're going out and hitting, the result of that particular authentication populates what we call an identity context. And that identity context can contain whatever information you choose. And we feed that identity context down into the resolver, and the resolver can make the decision on whether or not to move forward with that field based on claims that you may have in that particular identity context. So using that, we can definitely give you field level access control based on some sort of identity claim.
Okay, and that is the last question that has come in. With that in mind, as you think of any last second questions, I'll ask the Arvata team if they have anything else they'd like to share.
I'm good, thank you, Bill, and your team for the opportunity to present. I think it was a great call, and I appreciate the interaction from the field in the end.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, we'll finish on that note. I'd like to thank the Arvata team for coming in and joining us today and talking about how to implement an enterprise GraphQL server, as well as sharing a bit about their company. Do not forget, about April 29th, you get a two-parter. We're going to be talking about a new industry-shaking concept around the API Academy, and then we'll be talking about OAuth and OpenID Connect. And with that, thank you once again, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the week, and please stay safe.